The chandelier in the grand foyer of the Beauregard estate sparkled faintly, its light barely piercing the heavy tension that cloaked the house. Alice Beauregard sat alone in her room, the rich mahogany walls closing in on her as the wedding gown hung like a ghostly presence behind her. She glanced at the mirror, catching a glimpse of her reflection, the pale face of a woman cornered by fate. Her hands tightened around the delicate fabric of her dress, a symbol of the life she was being forced into. Downstairs, the preparations were well underway. Servants moved with hurried precision, arranging flowers and setting tables for the extravagant event. But Alice could only hear her own thoughts, louder and more insistent than the bustle below. She thought of her mother, Claire, and how she used to say, "Freedom isn't just given. Sometimes you have to fight for it." That mantra had carried her through many moments of doubt, but tonight it felt more like a taunt than reassurance. Her father, Alain Beauregard, had tried to justify this arrangement. "The Devereux family has the resources to save us," he had said the night before, his voice strained and brittle. "David can secure everything we've worked for." But Alice knew the truth. This wasn't a partnership. It was a transaction, with her as the collateral. Pulling herself from the suffocating stillness of the room, Alice moved to her dresser. Her fingers traced the edge of a small wooden box she had discovered earlier that week. Inside was her mother's journal, a relic of Claire's sharp mind and relentless determination. Alice had read it cover to cover, finding notes about business deals and warnings about people who couldn't be trusted, people like David Devereux. She opened the journal to one of the marked pages, rereading Claire's words. "David Devereux is not who he appears to be. There is something buried beneath his charm, a danger that could destroy anyone in his path. Be careful, my love. Watch closely." Claire's suspicions had always lingered in the background of their family's dealings, but no one had taken them seriously. Now, as Alice faced the prospect of becoming David's wife, her mother's words felt like a lifeline and a warning. Alice's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. "Miss Beauregard?" a servant called hesitantly. "Your father is asking for you. He wants to discuss the final arrangements." Her chest tightened. The walls seemed to press closer as she realized her time was running out. She needed to act now or forever lose her chance at freedom. Her gaze shifted to the window. The evening air beckoned with the promise of escape, and for the first time in days, Alice felt a spark of hope. She knew about the hidden passage that led from the east wing to the garden, a relic of the mansion's history. It had been sealed for years, but she had discovered the mechanism to unlock it just days before. Alice crossed the room to her armoire, retrieving a small bag she had packed in secret. Inside were a pair of simple flats, some cash, and a map of the estate grounds. She hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the journal and tucking it into the bag. Claire's words would guide her no matter where she ended up. Before leaving, Alice turned to the wedding gown. Its intricate lace shimmered under the dim light, mocking her with its beauty. "Not today," she whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the storm inside. With one last look at the room she had grown up in, Alice stepped toward the door. The sound of voices echoed up the stairwell as she made her way to the hidden passage. She clutched the bag tightly, her heart pounding as she counted each step. The passageway was behind an old tapestry in the east wing, one she had watched servants pass countless times without noticing. Her fingers found the hidden latch, and with a soft click, the panel slid open. She slipped inside, the narrow corridor enveloping her in darkness. As the door closed behind her, the muffled noise of the house faded, leaving only the sound of her shallow breathing. The night outside waited. Alice moved cautiously through the narrow passage, her fingers brushing against the cold, uneven walls. The faint scent of dust and age filled the air, a stark contrast to the floral arrangements and polished elegance of the mansion above. Her heart raced as her footsteps echoed softly, each step bringing her closer to freedom and further from the life that had been decided for her. The passage opened into a small alcove near the garden, concealed behind a cluster of dense hedges. Alice pushed the hidden panel outward, wincing at the slight creak of the hinge. Cool evening air greeted her, laced with the faint fragrance of magnolias and roses from the manicured grounds. She stepped out carefully, pulling the panel shut behind her. Her eyes scanned the garden, illuminated by scattered lanterns and the pale glow of moonlight. Her father's voice echoed faintly from the terrace on the far side of the house, mingled with the low murmur of David Devereux's unmistakably smooth tone. She stiffened, instinctively crouching behind the hedges. Peering through the foliage, she saw them standing together near the fountain, their postures relaxed, but their conversation tense. "She understands her duty," Alain said, though his voice carried an edge of doubt. "Alice knows what's at stake." David's expression remained unreadable, but the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. "She better," he replied evenly. "The success of this partnership depends on her cooperation. If she falters, I expect you to ensure she stays in line." Alice's stomach twisted at his words. She had suspected David's intentions were far from noble, but hearing them confirmed filled her with a renewed sense of urgency. She couldn't let this man, or anyone else, control her future. The crunch of gravel nearby startled her, and she quickly ducked lower. A pair of guards strode across the garden, their flashlights casting sweeping beams of light. Her pulse quickened as she clutched her bag tightly and pressed herself against the hedge. She needed to reach the outer gate without being seen, but the patrols were closer than she had anticipated. She waited until the guards disappeared around a corner before darting to the next hedge, her movements swift and silent. Her flats barely made a sound on the soft grass, but every shadow seemed to loom larger, every noise magnified. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring no one had spotted her, before pressing forward. As she approached the small gate at the far edge of the estate, her path was suddenly illuminated by a beam of light. "Who's there?" a voice demanded, sharp and commanding. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a tall figure in a security uniform. The name tag on his chest read Carson Cross. Alice's mind raced. She recognized him as one of the newer hires, someone David had brought in for added security. His sharp eyes studied her intently, and she realized she didn't have much time to act. She stammered, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. The sound of distant footsteps approaching made her decision for her. Without another word, she lunged forward, grabbing his lapel and pressing her lips against his in a desperate, impulsive move. The kiss was brief, but it was enough. Carson hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard, before stepping back slightly. His eyes searched hers, and Alice saw something unexpected in his expression. Curiosity, maybe even understanding. The approaching footsteps grew louder, and Carson glanced in their direction before meeting her gaze again. "Follow me," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Alice blinked, surprised by his response, but there was no time to question him. He grabbed her wrist and led her toward a concealed path hidden by tall shrubbery. They moved quickly and silently, the sound of the approaching guards fading behind them. As they reached a secluded corner of the estate, Carson stopped and turned to her. "You don't have much time," he said, his tone low. "If you're trying to escape, you need to move now. There's a service road past the gate. It'll take you to the main road." Alice hesitated, her instincts telling her not to trust him so easily. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carson's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something genuine in his eyes. "Let's just say "I don't agree with what's happening here," he replied. "Now go." The urgency in his voice spurred her into action. Alice nodded, clutching her bag tightly as she slipped past the gate. For the first time that night, she felt the thrill of hope surge through her. She didn't know where the road would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. The night air was cool against Alice's flushed cheeks as she hurried down the narrow service road Carson had directed her to. Her wedding gown, with its delicate lace and layers of fabric, felt like a cumbersome reminder of everything she was leaving behind. She clutched the small bag tightly against her chest, the edges of her mother's journal pressing into her palm like an anchor. Each step away from the Beauregard estate brought a mix of relief and trepidation. She could still hear her father's voice echoing in her mind. "This marriage is for the good of the family." But how could sacrificing her freedom ever be the right choice? Alice shook the thought away and focused on the road ahead. It was quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind to break the silence. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see David's men closing in on her. As she neared the edge of the estate grounds, Alice's heart began to steady. The gravel path transitioned into asphalt, signaling the start of the main road Carson had mentioned. In the faint moonlight, she could make out the silhouette of a large oak tree and a small bench beneath it. She paused for a moment to catch her breath, leaning against the trunk for support. The sound of footsteps startled her. They weren't distant or muffled. They were close, deliberate, and purposeful. Her pulse quickened as she pressed herself into the shadow of the tree, trying to make herself invisible. She tightened her grip on the bag, her eyes darting toward the source of the noise. From the darkness emerged Carson, his tall figure unmistakable even in the dim light. His movements were measured, his gaze scanning the area before settling on her. Alice straightened, her relief tempered by suspicion. "You again," she said, her voice low but firm. "What are you doing here?" Carson raised an eyebrow, his expression calm yet unreadable. "Making sure you didn't get yourself caught." Alice frowned, unsure of his motives. "Why would you care? You work for David, don't you?" For a moment he didn't answer. Instead he stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of intensity and curiosity. "Let's just say my loyalty doesn't lie with him," Carson replied, his voice even. "I told you before, I don't agree with what's happening." Alice studied him, her instincts urging her to tread carefully. She had spent years navigating the world of her family's business, learning to read people and their intentions. Carson's calm demeanor and deliberate words hinted at more than he was revealing, but she couldn't discern whether he was an ally or a new kind of threat. "And why should I trust you?" she asked, her tone challenging. "You shouldn't," Carson said simply, his expression softening slightly. "But I'm the only one here who's not trying to drag you back to that mansion." Alice hesitated, her grip on the bag loosening slightly as she considered his words. There was a logic to what he was saying, and though her instinct was to remain guarded, she couldn't deny that he had helped her escape. Before she could respond, the faint sound of a car engine reached her ears. Carson's head snapped toward the road, his posture tensing. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Alice nodded, her trust tentative but growing. Without another word, she followed Carson as he led her toward the denser part of the woods, the sound of the approaching vehicle growing louder with each passing second. The trees grew thicker as Carson led Alice deeper into the woods, their steps muffled by the soft forest floor. The hum of the car engine faded in and out as it maneuvered along the nearby road, headlights slicing through the darkness in sporadic bursts. Alice's breath came in shallow gasps, the adrenaline of the chase tightening her chest. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's an old service shed near the edge of the forest," Carson replied, his tone steady. "It's been abandoned for years. We can hide there until the patrols clear out." Alice nodded, though her doubts lingered. Each step away from the road felt like stepping further into the unknown. She was relying on Carson, a man she'd met just hours ago, and every instinct she had screamed caution. But the determination in his voice and the sharp awareness in his movements suggested he was no stranger to situations like this. They moved swiftly, weaving through the dense underbrush until the outline of a small wooden structure came into view. The shed was worn, its walls weathered and patched with creeping vines, but it offered the promise of shelter. Carson pushed the door open with a quiet creak and motioned for Alice to enter. Inside, the air was damp and stale, heavy with the scent of wood rot. Alice set her bag down on an old crate and leaned against the wall, her legs trembling from the exertion and stress of the escape. Carson stayed by the door, peering through a gap in the wood to monitor the road. "They're circling back," he said after a moment, his voice low. "It won't be long before they start searching the woods." Alice's stomach clenched. "If they find us—" "They won't," Carson interrupted firmly. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. "You've made it this far, haven't you?" His words were meant to reassure, but Alice couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. She sank onto the crate, running her fingers over the strap of her bag. Her mother's journal was inside, a weight both literal and figurative. "What happens after this?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I can't just keep running forever." Carson leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "You'll need more than just distance," he admitted. "David's not the kind of man who lets things go. If you want to disappear for good, you'll need a plan." Alice's jaw tightened. "And what about you? What's your plan in all of this?" Carson's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were calculating how much to reveal. "Let's just say David and I have unfinished business," he said finally. "Helping you is part of that." Alice frowned, her curiosity piqued but her trust still tentative. "So, this isn't just about me?" "No," Carson said, meeting her gaze directly. "But right now, getting you out of this mess is the priority." The sound of voices in the distance cut through the moment, sending a jolt of alarm through Alice. Carson straightened, moving back to the door. "Stay quiet," he instructed, his tone sharper now. "If they come this way, don't move." Alice's heart pounded as she crouched behind the crate, gripping her bag tightly. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied by the muffled crackle of radios. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed as she listened. The voices grew louder, then suddenly receded, fading back toward the road. Carson didn't move until the silence returned, his posture relaxing only slightly as he stepped away from the door. "They're moving on," he said, glancing back at Alice, "but it's not safe to stay here for long. We'll have to keep moving." Alice stood, her legs still shaky, but her resolve strengthening. "Lead the way," she said, her voice firm. Carson nodded, opening the door just enough to let in the faint moonlight. As they stepped back into the woods, Alice's grip on her bag tightened. She didn't know where this path would take her, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. Alice stumbled slightly as she and Carson navigated deeper into the woods. The thick canopy overhead blocked most of the moonlight, leaving the path dim and treacherous. Her hands clutched the straps of her bag, and she focused on each step, forcing herself to match Carson's swift and deliberate pace. He moved with a quiet confidence, his sharp gaze scanning their surroundings for any signs of movement. The tension between them hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Alice wanted to ask more about his connection to David, but the urgency of their escape left little room for questions. After what felt like an eternity, Carson stopped abruptly and held up a hand, signaling her to pause. Alice froze, her breath catching as she strained to listen. In the distance, the faint crackle of a radio and the low murmur of voices drifted through the trees. The search party was still nearby. "They're splitting up," Carson whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned to Alice, his expression serious. "We need to stay ahead of them. Keep close and step where I step." Alice nodded, her heart pounding as she followed him. They moved carefully, weaving through the dense underbrush and avoiding open areas where the beams of flashlights might find them. The forest seemed alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the faint crunch of boots on twigs. Every noise felt amplified, a reminder of how vulnerable they were. Carson led her toward a shallow ravine, its steep incline offering natural cover. As they descended, Alice's foot slipped on a loose rock, and she barely suppressed a gasp as Carson caught her arm. His grip was firm but not harsh, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. "Careful," he said, his tone softer than she expected. "One wrong move, and they'll hear us." Alice swallowed hard and nodded again. She steadied herself and continued, her determination growing despite the fear coiling in her chest. Reaching the bottom of the ravine, they crouched behind a cluster of boulders, taking a moment to catch their breath. "Do you think they'll come this way?" Alice asked, her voice a whisper. Carson tilted his head, listening intently. "It's possible," he admitted, "but they're more likely to stick to the paths for now. They don't know this area as well as I do." Alice furrowed her brow. "How do you know it so well?" Carson hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say I've spent time preparing for situations like this," he said finally. "David doesn't exactly inspire loyalty in his employees." Alice wanted to press further, but the sound of snapping twigs nearby silenced her. Carson motioned for her to stay low as the faint glow of a flashlight swept across the ravine. She held her breath, her pulse racing as the light passed over the rocks without lingering. The footsteps faded after a moment, and Carson exhaled quietly. "They're heading back toward the main road," he said. "We need to move before they circle around again." Alice stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To someone who can help," Carson replied, "but it's going to take time to get there." Without waiting for her response, he began climbing out of the ravine. Alice followed, her curiosity growing with every step. As they climbed out of the ravine, the forest began to thin, revealing glimpses of the open sky through gaps in the trees. The moonlight provided just enough illumination to guide their path. Alice's muscles ached from the constant movement, but she pushed forward, driven by a mixture of adrenaline and resolve. She couldn't allow herself to falter, not when freedom was so close, yet still so uncertain. Carson slowed his pace as they reached a narrow dirt trail winding its way through the woods. He crouched low, motioning for Alice to do the same, and scanned the area ahead. Satisfied that they were alone, he gestured for her to follow him onto the path. "We'll stick to this trail for now," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's quieter than cutting through the brush, and it'll lead us closer to the city." "The city?" Alice echoed, surprised. "You're taking me back to New Orleans?" Carson glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Not exactly. There's someone in the French Quarter who can give us temporary shelter. She's resourceful." Alice's brow furrowed at his choice of words. "Who is she?" "A friend," he replied curtly, not offering any further explanation. Before Alice could press him, the distant sound of engines shattered the relative quiet of the forest. She froze, instinctively stepping closer to Carson as the rumble grew louder. It wasn't just one vehicle, there were several, and they were moving fast. "They're sweeping the perimeter," Carson muttered, his jaw tightening. We need to pick up the pace." They broke into a brisk jog, the dirt trail crunching softly beneath their feet. The sound of the vehicles grew louder, and Alice's heart sank as beams of light began to cut through the trees behind them. The search parties had expanded their range, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up. "This way!" Carson said sharply, veering off the trail and into a dense thicket. The branches snagged on Alice's dress as she followed, but she didn't dare slow down. Carson led them to a shallow ditch hidden beneath a canopy of low-hanging branches and motioned for her to get down. Alice crouched beside him, her breathing shallow as the search vehicles drew closer. The roar of engines was deafening now, accompanied by the harsh glare of headlights sweeping through the forest. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm as the beams of light passed just feet from their hiding spot. One of the vehicles stopped nearby, the engine idling as voices barked orders over radios. Alice pressed herself against the ground, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could feel Carson's presence beside her, steady and unyielding, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. After what felt like an eternity, the vehicle roared back to life and sped away, its taillights disappearing into the distance. The forest fell silent once more, save for the distant hum of the remaining search parties. Carson let out a slow breath and turned to Alice. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "They're widening their search grid. If we don't reach Margot soon, we'll be out of options." Alice nodded, her fear tempered by a newfound determination. "Then let's keep moving." They emerged from the ditch and pressed forward, navigating the increasingly uneven terrain. As the first hints of dawn began to streak the sky, Carson finally slowed, pointing toward a dim glow on the horizon. "There," he said. "That's the French Quarter. We're almost there." Relief flooded through Alice, but it was tempered by the weight of everything still ahead. She didn't know who Margot was or why Carson trusted her, but for now she had no choice but to follow him. Whatever awaited her in the city, she could only hope it would bring her one step closer to reclaiming her life. The French Quarter stirred with the quiet buzz of the early morning, the cobblestone streets glistening with remnants of dew under the dim light of wrought-iron street lamps. The faint aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, hinting at a city slowly waking from its slumber. Alice followed Carson closely, her steps hesitant but steady as he navigated the narrow alleys with practiced ease. The tension in her chest eased slightly as they moved further from the forest and deeper into the heart of the city. Yet her mind raced with unanswered questions. Who was this mysterious friend Carson spoke of? And why was he so intent on helping her? The man seemed to be a collection of contradictions, calm under pressure but guarded, helpful yet distant. Carson stopped suddenly in front of a nondescript door tucked between two aging brick buildings. A faded sign above the door read, "The Crimson Spire," though the letters were barely legible beneath layers of chipped paint. He knocked twice in a distinct rhythm, the sound echoing faintly in the quiet street. The door creaked open, revealing a woman with auburn hair loosely tied back and piercing green eyes that immediately swept over Alice with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She was dressed in casual clothes, a leather jacket over a plain grey shirt, but her posture and sharp gaze exuded a quiet authority. "Carson," the woman said, her tone flat. "You've got nerve showing up here unannounced." "Margot," Carson replied evenly. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't important." Margot's eyes narrowed, her attention shifting to Alice. "And who's this?" "Alice Beauregard," Carson said, stepping slightly aside to gesture toward her. "She needs a safe place, just for a little while." Margot raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Beauregard, as in the family mansion on the edge of the city. Carson, you've really outdone yourself this time." "She's not here to cause trouble," Carson said firmly. She's running from David Devereux." At the mention of David's name, Margot's expression hardened. She studied Alice for a moment longer before stepping aside. "Get in, quickly." Alice hesitated, glancing at Carson, who gave her a slight nod. She stepped inside, the dimly lit interior of the bar a stark contrast to the colourful streets outside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and a faint hint of whiskey, though the room was devoid of the usual patrons. Tables were neatly arranged, chairs stacked on top of them in preparation for the day ahead. Margot closed the door behind them and locked it, before turning to face Carson. "You'd better start explaining. Why is she running from Devereux?" Carson leaned against the bar, his expression grim. "David's trying to force her into a marriage to secure control of her family's assets. She refused, and now he's hunting her down." Margot let out a low whistle, shaking her head. "Classic Devereux. He doesn't take no for an answer." Alice shifted uncomfortably under Margot's scrutiny. "Why do you hate him so much?" she asked cautiously. Margot's lips twitched into a wry smile. "Let's just say I've had my share of dealings with David. None of them ended well." Before Alice could press further, Carson spoke again. "We don't have much time. His men are already searching the forest. It's only a matter of time before they widen their search to the city." Margot nodded, her demeanor growing serious. "You're right. She can stay here for now, but this place isn't exactly foolproof. You'll need to figure out your next move fast." Alice's stomach churned as she processed the weight of Margot's words. She had barely escaped, and now it seemed the danger was closer than ever. Margot motioned for them to follow her to the back of the bar, where a narrow hallway led to a small private room. Inside, there was a modest couch, a battered coffee table, and a stack of newspapers piled in one corner. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and dust, but it offered a sense of seclusion that Alice welcomed. "This is as safe as it gets for now," Margot said, gesturing to the space. "I'll keep watch out front. If anyone comes sniffing around, you'll hear about it before they get close." "Thank you," Alice said softly, though the gratitude felt insufficient for what this stranger was offering her. Margot waved her off. "Don't thank me yet. Carson knows I don't do charity work." Carson smirked faintly. "I'll owe you one." "You already do," Margot shot back before leaving the room, her footsteps fading as she returned to the main bar. As the door clicked shut behind her, Alice dropped onto the couch, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. She set her bag down on the floor and let her head fall into her hands. The whirlwind of the past few hours was catching up to her, and for the first time since she'd fled the Beauregard estate, the weight of it all felt unbearable. Carson sat down across from her, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched her carefully. "You're handling this better than most would," he said after a moment. Alice raised her head, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of weariness and defiance. "I don't have much of a choice, do I?" "No," Carson admitted, "but that doesn't make it any less impressive." She studied him for a moment, her curiosity finally bubbling to the surface. "Why are you helping me, Carson? You said this has something to do with unfinished business with David, but that's not the whole truth, is it?" Carson's expression hardened slightly, though not out of anger. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he seemed to weigh his response. "David Devereux is a problem I've been dealing with for a long time," he began. "He's dangerous, not just to you, but to anyone who gets in his way. I've seen the damage he can do, and I've had enough." Alice's gaze didn't waver. "And what about me? Am I just part of your plan to get back at him?" "No," Carson said firmly, his voice carrying an edge of sincerity that caught her off guard. "This isn't just about him. You don't deserve to be dragged into his schemes, and I'm not going to stand by and let it happen." Alice wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What makes you so sure you can stop him?" A flicker of something dangerous flashed in Carson's eyes. Because I know him better than he thinks, and because I'm not working alone. Before Alice could ask what he meant, the door creaked open, and Margot reappeared, her expression serious. "We've got company," she said. "Two men, suits, trying to look inconspicuous. They're across the street, but it's obvious they're watching the place." Carson stood immediately, his demeanor shifting into one of sharp focus. "How long have they been there?" "Not long," Margot replied. "But if they're here, it means David's getting close." Alice's stomach twisted with fear, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do we do now?" Carson turned to her, his jaw set with determination. "We leave. Margot, can you get us out the back?" Margot nodded. "There's an alley that leads to a side street. It's tight, but if you're quick, you can lose them." "Good," Carson said, grabbing Alice's bag and handing it to her. "We're not sticking around to see what they want." Alice's hands trembled as she took the bag, but she nodded, steeling herself for whatever came next. The fleeting sense of safety she'd felt here had vanished, replaced by the cold reality that she was still being hunted. "Let's go," Carson said, his voice calm but commanding. He opened the door, motioning for Alice to follow. As they stepped into the alley, the faint sound of footsteps and murmured voices reminded her of just how high the stakes had become. There was no turning back now. Alice followed Carson through the narrow alley, the walls of the surrounding buildings towering over them like silent sentinels. The air was heavy with the faint smell of damp stone and discarded waste, a sharp contrast to the French Quarter's usual charm. Margot had stayed behind to misdirect their pursuers, but Alice couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. Every step felt perilous, each turn a potential ambush. Carson moved with practiced precision, his gaze scanning their surroundings as they emerged onto a side street. He held up a hand to signal for her to stop, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the road ahead. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and the stillness only heightened the tension. "They're spreading out," Carson muttered under his breath. "We need to stay ahead of them." Alice clutched her bag tighter, her fingers brushing against the edges of her mother's journal inside. "Where are we going now?" she whispered. "To someone who can help," Carson replied without turning. "But it's going to take some maneuvering to get there without being seen." Alice's brow furrowed. She was growing tired of vague answers and half-truths, but this wasn't the time to press him. Trusting Carson was a gamble, but so far he'd proven himself capable. She took a steadying breath and followed as he led her down another narrow alley, their footsteps muffled against the uneven cobblestones. As they rounded a corner, the sound of approaching voices made Alice's heart leap. Carson grabbed her arm and pulled her into a recessed doorway, pressing a finger to his lips. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clack of shoes on stone. Alice held her breath, her pulse racing as two men in dark suits passed by, their expressions sharp and their eyes scanning the area. "They're close," she whispered once the men were out of earshot. "Too close," Carson agreed, his jaw tightening. "We can't keep dodging them forever." He stepped out of the doorway and motioned for her to follow. They continued down the alley until they reached a metal gate blocking the path. Carson inspected it briefly before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a slim tool. With practiced ease, he picked the lock and pushed the gate open, gesturing for Alice to step through. On the other side was a quieter section of the quarter, the streets lined with dimly lit townhouses and shuttered shops. Carson closed the gate behind them and paused, his expression thoughtful. "This way," he said, pointing toward a narrow lane that disappeared into the shadows. "We'll cut through here and double back. It'll throw them off if they're still following." Alice nodded, though the growing labyrinth of alleys and side streets left her feeling disoriented. The city she had once known so well now felt foreign, its charm overshadowed by the weight of her predicament. As they continued, Carson glanced at her, his voice softer when he spoke. "You're doing well," he said. "Not everyone could handle this kind of pressure." Alice met his gaze, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "I don't feel like I'm handling it," she admitted. "I feel like I'm barely keeping up." "You're still moving," Carson replied. "That's more than most." Before Alice could respond, the faint hum of an engine reached their ears. Carson froze, his hand instinctively reaching for her arm as he scanned the street ahead. The car slowed as it approached their position, its headlights casting long shadows across the cobblestones. "Get down," Carson said quickly, pulling Alice toward a stack of wooden crates near the edge of the lane. They crouched behind the crates as the car rolled past, its tinted windows offering no hint of who might be inside. When the vehicle disappeared around the corner, Carson exhaled quietly. "That was too close," he muttered. "We need to move faster." Alice nodded, her pulse still racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that their window for escape was closing, and the weight of that realization only added to the urgency of each step. Carson led Alice through another winding series of alleys, his pace quickening as the danger around them seemed to intensify. The soft patter of their footsteps echoed faintly, a reminder of how exposed they were despite the maze-like cover of the French Quarter. Alice's mind raced alongside her heartbeat, her thoughts flickering between the immediate peril and the unanswered questions she carried. Finally, they emerged into a small, secluded courtyard illuminated by the faint glow of a gas lamp. Carson slowed, his gaze sweeping the area before nodding in satisfaction. "We're clear for now," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Alice sank onto the edge of a stone planter, her legs trembling from the relentless tension and physical exertion. "How much farther?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Not far," Carson replied, leaning against a nearby wall as he pulled a phone from his pocket. He tapped the screen a few times before bringing it to his ear. "We'll have backup soon." "Backup?" Alice's brow furrowed. "I thought you were taking me to someone who could help." "I am," Carson said, lowering the phone and slipping it back into his pocket. "Camilla. She's part of my team, tech expert, resourceful, and someone I trust. She'll get us what we need to plan the next move." Alice studied him, her skepticism lingering. "You really think she can help us stop David?" Carson met her gaze, his expression firm. "She's helped me stay one step ahead of him so far. Trust me, if anyone can give us an edge, it's her." Before Alice could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both tense. Carson signaled for her to stay low as he stepped toward the edge of the courtyard, his movements silent and deliberate. He peered around the corner, his body taut with anticipation. A moment later, a figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman with cropped dark hair and a leather jacket that looked well worn but practical. She held up her hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing on her lips. "Relax, it's me," she said, her voice light but tinged with urgency. "Camilla," Carson said, his posture relaxing slightly. "You're early." "Your text made it sound like you didn't have time to waste," Camilla replied, her sharp eyes flicking to Alice. "So, this is the infamous Alice Beauregard." Alice stood, brushing dust from her skirt as she faced Camilla. "I wouldn't call myself infamous," she said cautiously. "Yet," Camilla quipped with a wink. "But if David's chasing you this hard, you've definitely made an impression." "Can we save the introductions for later?" Carson interjected. "What did you bring?" Camilla reached into her bag and pulled out a slim laptop along with a small black case. "Everything you asked for," she said, setting the items on a nearby bench. "I've got access to David's security feeds and a map of his operations in the city. If he's got men stationed nearby, we'll know." Alice's eyebrows shot up. "You can do all that?" Camilla grinned. "Sweetheart, I can do a lot more than that." Carson ignored the banter and leaned over the laptop as Camilla opened it, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Within moments, a detailed map of the French Quarter appeared on the screen, marked with red dots that seemed to pulse ominously. "These are his men," Camilla explained, pointing to the dots. "Looks like he's focusing most of his resources around the quarter and the main road leading out of the city. He's got at least 2 units sweeping this area." "What about Margot?" Carson asked. Camilla's expression darkened. "She's fine for now, but it looks like they're keeping eyes on her bar. If they figure out you were there, it won't stay fine for long." Alice's chest tightened at the thought of Margot being caught in David's web. "We have to do something," she said. "We can't just leave her there." "We won't," Carson said firmly. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. If we don't, none of this will matter." Camilla nodded, her focus already shifting back to the map. "There's a gap in their patrol routes here," she said, pointing to a narrow alley on the screen. "If you move fast, you can slip through and get to the safe house. It's secure enough to buy us some time." "And after that?" Alice asked, her voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath it. "After that," Carson said, "we start taking David's operation apart, piece by piece." The resolve in his voice struck a chord in Alice. She didn't know if she could fully trust him yet, but for now he was her best and only chance at survival. As Carson and Camilla finalized their plan, she steeled herself for the road ahead, knowing that her fight was only just beginning. The gala glittered with an air of opulence that masked the tension simmering beneath its surface. The grand ballroom of the Devereux estate was a spectacle of wealth, its gilded columns and crystal chandeliers reflecting the soft glow of candlelight. Guests in designer attire milled about, their conversations a symphony of pleasantries that belied the undercurrent of power plays at work. Alice stepped inside, her heart pounding beneath the sleek black gown she wore. The dress, borrowed from Camilla's stash of disguises, was far simpler than the lavish outfits around her, but it allowed her to move without drawing too much attention. Beside her, Carson looked every bit the confident insider, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly. His posture was relaxed, but Alice could see the sharp focus in his eyes as he scanned the room. "Stay close," Carson murmured, his voice low and steady. "We'll make our move once I get access to David's private office. Keep an eye out for anyone who looks out of place." Alice nodded, her palms damp as she clutched the small clutch bag that concealed a device Camilla had given her. It was a signal disruptor designed to disable the estate's security cameras for a short window of time. She'd been instructed to activate it at Carson's signal, a task that seemed simple in theory but loomed large in her mind amidst the glittering chaos of the gala. As they moved through the crowd, Alice couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. She recognized many of the guests, powerful figures from the city's business and political elite. These were people she had grown up around, people who had once praised her family's success. Now they mingled under the shadow of David Devereux's influence, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the darker motives behind his empire. "Don't lose focus," Carson's voice cut through her thoughts, grounding her. He gestured subtly toward a side hallway guarded by 2 men in suits. "That's the entry to his office. I'll handle the guards. You stick to the plan." Alice swallowed hard and nodded again. Her hands tightened around the clutch as she followed Carson's lead, weaving through the crowd until they reached a point where the guards were within view. Carson straightened, adjusting his tie with a casual confidence that Alice couldn't help but admire. He approached the guards with the air of someone who belonged, his tone clipped and authoritative. "I need to speak with Mr. Devereux," Carson said, flashing an ID badge Camilla had forged for him. "It's about the Westlake acquisition." The guards exchanged a brief glance before stepping aside, their expressions neutral but wary. Carson turned to Alice, giving her a barely perceptible nod before disappearing down the hallway. Alice's stomach churned as she watched him go, the weight of her task settling heavily on her shoulders. She drifted toward the edge of the room, finding a spot near a cluster of potted palms that offered a semblance of privacy. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her clutch as she retrieved the disruptor, her pulse quickening. She had to time this perfectly. Too soon, and Carson wouldn't have enough time to access David's files. Too late, and they risked being caught on camera. Alice took a deep breath, steadying herself as she waited for Carson's signal. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that might suggest someone had noticed their movements. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the din of the gala, a dull roar in her ears. Then she saw it, a quick flash of light from the hallway. Carson's signal. Alice exhaled sharply and pressed the button on the disruptor. The small device emitted a faint buzz, almost imperceptible amidst the clinking of champagne glasses and the soft hum of conversation. She counted silently to 10, her pulse quickening with each passing second, before slipping the device back into her clutch. The cameras would now be disabled for 5 minutes, a small but critical window. Her eyes darted toward the hallway where Carson had disappeared. She couldn't see him, but she trusted he was already at work. Her own task was far from over. To avoid suspicion, she needed to blend into the crowd, appearing as if she were just another guest enjoying the evening. She approached the refreshment table, picking up a glass of champagne to steady her trembling hands. The bubbly liquid sparkled under the chandelier's glow, a stark contrast to the storm of anxiety brewing inside her. She took a small sip, her gaze sweeping the room for any sign of danger. That's when she saw him. David Devereux stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a small circle of influential figures. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his presence commanding. He laughed at something one of the men said, the sound rich and calculated. To anyone else, he would appear as the epitome of charm and success, but Alice saw the truth behind his polished exterior. His ambition, his ruthlessness. It was all laid bare in the cold glint of his eyes. Her grip tightened around the stem of the glass as a wave of anger surged through her. This man had tried to steal her freedom, her future, and now he stood here, basking in the admiration of others as if he were untouchable. Alice's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to act impulsively, not when so much was at stake. She shifted her position slightly, angling herself away from David's line of sight. The last thing she needed was for him to notice her and raise the alarm. Her mind raced with thoughts of Carson. Was he already inside the office? Had he found what they needed? The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slowly. Alice kept glancing toward the hallway, her heart sinking with every second that passed, without a sign of Carson. What if something had gone wrong? What if... Enjoying the party. The smooth, familiar voice sent a jolt of fear through her. Alice turned slowly, finding herself face to face with David. He smiled at her, the expression calculated and predatory. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone light, but with an edge that made her skin crawl. "I thought you'd be... otherwise occupied." Alice forced a polite smile, her mind scrambling for a response. "I didn't want to miss such a grand event," she said evenly, willing her voice not to waver. David's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with a curiosity that felt like a blade pressed against her skin. "You've been hard to track down, Alice. Running off like that. It's not very ladylike, is it?" She fought the urge to step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I needed some time to think," she said carefully. "Surely you can understand that." David tilted his head, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Of course. But you should know you've caused quite a bit of trouble. People are starting to wonder if you're... dependable." Alice's chest tightened, but she held her ground. "I'm here now," she said, her tone firm. "Isn't that what matters?" David's smile widened, though it only made her feel more uneasy. "We'll see," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "For now, enjoy the party. I'm sure we'll have much to discuss later." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Alice rooted in place. Her hands trembled as she set the champagne glass down, her thoughts racing. She needed to find Carson. Now her eyes darted back to the hallway, and relief flooded through her when she saw him re-emerge, his expression calm but purposeful. He walked toward her, his movements measured as he slipped seamlessly back into the crowd. "It's done," Carson murmured as he reached her. "We've got what we need." Alice exhaled shakily, her fear momentarily giving way to relief. But the encounter with David lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder that the battle was far from over. She glanced at Carson, her resolve hardening. "Then let's get out of here," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Carson nodded, his hand briefly brushing hers as they moved toward the exit. The night wasn't over, but they had taken a crucial step forward, and for Alice, the fight for her freedom was only just beginning. The safe house was dimly lit, its sparse furnishings lending it an air of practicality rather than comfort. Alice sat at the worn wooden table, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee she didn't remember making. The events of the gala replayed in her mind, every word and glance from David etched into her thoughts like a scar. She had come face to face with the man who had upended her life, and though she had held her composure, the encounter left her shaken. Carson stood across the room, speaking in hushed tones with Camilla, who had arrived shortly after they returned. The glow of her laptop illuminated their faces as they pored over the data he had retrieved from David's office. Alice couldn't make out their words, but the tension in their postures was unmistakable. Finally, Carson straightened and turned to face her, his expression grim but resolute. "We've confirmed what we suspected," he said. "David and Angela have been funneling money into a covert operation, something tied to a medical research facility just outside the city." Alice set the mug down, her heart sinking. "What kind of operation?" Camilla spoke up, her tone sharp and efficient. "It's bad. They're developing a bioweapon, a virus designed to target specific populations. The gala wasn't just a show of power, it was a cover for transferring key materials to the facility." Alice's stomach churned at the thought. "And my family's money was part of it," Carson interrupted, his voice heavy with anger. "David used your family's assets to fund this project, knowing no one would question it. He planned to secure the rest once you were under his control." Alice clenched her fists, a surge of rage rising within her. "How do we stop him?" Camilla gestured to the screen, pulling up a map of the city and its outskirts. "The research facility is here, heavily guarded and under strict surveillance. But there's a weak point, a delivery scheduled for tomorrow night. If we intercept it, we might be able to gather evidence and cripple their operation." Carson nodded, his eyes fixed on Alice. "This is the chance we've been waiting for, but it's dangerous. If we're caught—" "I'm not afraid," Alice said firmly, cutting him off. "I've come too far to let him win." Carson hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Whatever he saw seemed to convince him, because he nodded. "All right. We'll move tomorrow night." The weight of the plan settled over the room like a heavy fog. Alice rose from the table and moved to the window, staring out at the city beyond. The safe house was a world away from the life she had known, but for the first time she felt a sense of purpose. David had taken so much from her, but she would not let him take more. Her thoughts were interrupted by Camilla's voice, softer now. "There's one more thing," she said, glancing at Carson. "Margot's in trouble." Alice turned sharply. What do you mean? They've increased surveillance on her bar, Camilla said. David's men have started questioning people in the area. It's only a matter of time before they move in. Alice's chest tightened, guilt washing over her. Margot had risked everything to help her, and now she was paying the price. We have to help her, she said, her voice trembling. We will, Carson assured her. But we need to be smart about it. Rushing in without a plan will only make things worse, for all of us. Alice nodded reluctantly, knowing he was right. But the thought of Margot in danger weighed heavily on her, adding to the fire that burned within her. She turned back to the window, steeling herself for the battle ahead. The hours leading up to the operation dragged on, each second weighed down by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Alice couldn't sleep, her mind too consumed with thoughts of Margot and the plan Camilla and Carson had outlined. She sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, trying to gather her resolve. Carson approached quietly, his presence steady and grounding. You should try to rest, he said, leaning against the frame of the door. Tomorrow's going to be a long night. Alice shook her head. I can't. There's too much to think about, too much at stake. Carson crossed the room and sat on the edge of the table, his arms crossed. Worrying about it won't help. You need to keep your strength up. Alice looked up at him, her expression softening slightly. Is that how you manage it? All the danger, all the uncertainty? It's part of the job, Carson said simply, though there was an edge to his tone that hinted at the toll it had taken on him. But this, what we're doing now, is different. It's personal. Alice held his gaze, a question forming on her lips. But before she could voice it, Camilla's voice broke through from the other room. Got it! Carson stood immediately, motioning for Alice to follow. They entered the small, makeshift command center, where Camilla sat at her laptop, the screen displaying surveillance footage of Margot's bar. The feed showed two men in dark suits lingering near the entrance, their movements deliberate and watchful. They're setting up a perimeter, Camilla said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Looks like they're waiting for reinforcements before making a move. Alice's heart sank. We can't wait for tomorrow night, she said urgently. If they go in tonight, Margot won't stand a chance. Carson exchanged a look with Camilla, his jaw tightening. You're right, he said. We'll have to act now. But what about the facility? Camilla asked. If we divert resources to Margot, we might lose our shot at stopping the delivery. Carson ran a hand through his hair, clearly weighing the options. Alice stepped forward, her voice firm. We'll save Margot tonight and hit the facility tomorrow. We can't let her pay the price for helping us. Carson studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. Camilla, keep monitoring the feeds. If anything changes, let us know immediately. Camilla smirked. You got it. Be careful out there. Alice grabbed her bag, her determination hardening as they prepared to leave. Carson retrieved a small case from a hidden compartment and opened it, revealing a sleek handgun and a compact radio. He handed the radio to Alice, his expression serious. Stay close to me, he said. If anything goes wrong, you call for backup. Alice nodded, gripping the radio tightly as they slipped out into the night. The air was cool and still, the quiet streets lending an eerie calm to their hurried steps. The bar wasn't far, but every block felt like a mile as they approached the building, the silhouettes of David's men becoming clearer with each step. Carson signaled for Alice to stay back as he moved ahead, his movements precise and deliberate. She watched as he disappeared into the shadows, her breath catching as the tension grew unbearable. Seconds later, a muffled scuffle broke out near the side of the building, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the alley. Carson reappeared, motioning for Alice to follow. They've pulled back, but they'll regroup soon, he said. We need to get Margot out now. They entered the bar through a side door, the familiar scent of whiskey and aged wood hitting Alice like a wave of nostalgia. Margot was crouched behind the bar, her expression fierce despite the danger. She looked up as they entered, relief flashing across her face. "About time," Margot said, standing and brushing herself off. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "Never," Carson replied, his tone light but his movements urgent. "We need to move. Now." Margot nodded, grabbing a small bag from behind the counter. "Lead the way." The group slipped back into the alley, the sound of distant voices signaling that David's men were regrouping. Carson led them through a series of back streets, his pace relentless as they made their way toward the safe house. By the time they arrived, Alice's legs were trembling and her heart was pounding, but the sight of Margot safe and sound filled her with a renewed sense of hope. They had succeeded in saving her friend, but the battle was far from over. "We'll rest for a few hours," Carson said as they settled inside. "Tomorrow we take down the facility." Alice nodded, her resolve hardening. They were closer than ever to stopping David and Angela, and she wouldn't let anything stand in their way. The morning light seeped through the cracks in the blinds, casting faint patterns on the safe house walls. Alice sat at the table, her mother's journal spread open in front of her. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, reading the meticulous notes Claire had left behind about David and Angela's growing influence. Each word was a reminder of how far this web of deceit stretched, and how personal it all felt now. Across the room, Carson and Camilla were huddled around her laptop, their voices low as they finalized the plan for the night's operation. Margot, freshly showered and exuding her usual unflappable energy, leaned against the counter, sipping a cup of coffee. Despite the relative calm of the room, a sense of anticipation hung thick in the air. Alice tore her gaze from the journal and turned her attention to the map Camilla had pinned to the wall. It detailed the research facility's layout, with key points of entry and security marked in bright red ink. The delivery route was highlighted as well, a single road winding through the outskirts of the city, surrounded by dense forest. "What's the timeline?" Alice asked, her voice breaking the quiet. Camilla turned from the laptop, her expression focused. "The delivery is scheduled for 11 p.m. It's a single transport van, heavily guarded. They'll make a stop at the facility's north entrance to unload." "Guards?" Carson asked, leaning closer to examine the map. "3 on the van, plus at least 2 at the entrance," Camilla replied. "That's the minimum. Knowing David, there could be more inside." Alice frowned. "What about the security system? Cameras, alarms?" Camilla smirked. "Already working on it. I'll disable the cameras in your entry zone, but I can't keep them down for long. You'll have a 15-minute window, max." Carson nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the map. "We'll intercept the van here," he pointed to a stretch of road just before the facility, "and neutralize the guards before they can call for backup. Once we have the materials, we'll extract and head to the secondary site for analysis." Alice's pulse quickened at the sheer scale of the plan. "What if something goes wrong?" "It won't," Carson said firmly, though there was a steel edge to his voice that betrayed the weight of the risk. "We'll stick to the plan and stay sharp." Margot chuckled softly, breaking the tension. "That's a lot of confidence for someone who's walking into a lion's den." "Confidence is half the battle," Carson shot back, though his tone held a hint of humor. Despite the levity, Alice could feel the strain in the room. They were venturing into dangerous territory, and failure wasn't an option. As the day wore on, the group worked tirelessly, reviewing every detail of the operation until the plan was etched into their minds. By nightfall, the safe house was a hive of quiet preparation. Carson loaded the weapons and gear into the back of an inconspicuous van, while Camilla double-checked her equipment. Alice stood by the window, watching the darkened streets below. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she steeled herself for what was to come. This was it, the moment they would strike back. Alice turned to Carson, her resolve clear in her gaze. Let's do this. The van moved quietly along the deserted road, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness of the surrounding forest. Inside, the tension was palpable. Alice sat in the back, her hands resting on her lap as she stared out the window, the faint outlines of trees rushing past. Carson sat across from her, double-checking the weapons and equipment laid out on the seat beside him. Camilla was in the front passenger seat, monitoring a tablet that displayed the facility's security feed in real time. "We're 5 minutes out," Camilla announced, her voice steady despite the tension. "Cameras are still on schedule to go offline once we hit the intercept point." Carson nodded, his attention shifting to Alice. "You ready?" Alice met his gaze, her nerves bubbling just beneath the surface. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice firm despite the weight of her apprehension. Carson gave her a reassuring nod before turning his attention to Camilla. "Once we hit the van, I need you to keep those cameras down until we're clear. No room for error." "You're telling me how to do my job?" Camilla shot back, her lips twitching into a faint smirk. "Don't worry, boss. I've got this." The van slowed as they approached the intercept point, a narrow stretch of road flanked by thick trees on either side. The group had chosen this location for its isolation. There would be no witnesses and no easy escape for the target. Carson signaled for the driver to stop, and they all climbed out, their movements swift and silent. Alice followed Carson and Margot into the shadows, the cool night air biting at her skin. The plan was simple: disable the transport van, neutralize the guards, and secure the cargo. Simple in theory, but the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on Alice's chest. The distant hum of an engine broke the silence, drawing everyone's attention. Carson raised his hand, signaling for them to take their positions. Camilla crouched by the van, her tablet glowing faintly as she prepared to disable the cameras. Alice found herself behind a large tree, her breathing shallow as she clutched the small radio Carson had given her. The transport van came into view, its headlights casting eerie shadows across the road. It slowed as it neared their position, and Carson raised his weapon, a tranquilizer gun designed to take out the guards without causing fatal injuries. He waited until the van was just a few feet away before stepping into the road, his figure illuminated briefly by the headlights. "Now," Carson ordered, his voice low and commanding. Camilla tapped her tablet, and the cameras along the road blinked out. At the same moment, Margot released a spike strip across the road, and the van's tires screeched as it skidded to a halt. Carson moved quickly, firing his tranquilizer at the driver and the guard in the passenger seat before they could react. Alice's heart pounded as the scene unfolded in seconds. She stepped out from behind the tree, clutching her bag as Carson and Margot opened the back doors of the van. Inside, 2 more guards stirred, but before they could react, Margot had them subdued with quick, precise movements. "Clear!" Carson called, his voice sharp and focused. He turned to Alice, gesturing for her to approach. "Let's see what we've got." Alice hurried to the back of the van, her eyes widening as she took in the crates stacked neatly inside. Camilla joined them, her tablet in hand as she scanned the labels on the cargo. "This is it," Camilla said, her tone grim. "Everything matches the records: samples, schematics, and documentation." Carson glanced at Alice. "This is the evidence we need to shut them down." Alice nodded, the weight of their discovery settling over her. They were one step closer to exposing David and Angela's plans, but the danger was far from over. As they loaded the crates into their van, the faint sound of distant engines reached her ears, sending a chill down her spine. "They're coming," Camilla warned, her voice tense. "We need to move, now." Carson didn't hesitate. "Let's go," he barked, ushering everyone back into the van. As the engine roared to life, Alice felt a surge of adrenaline. The night wasn't over yet, and the fight was far from won, but for the first time, She felt a glimmer of hope. They had the evidence, and with it, the power to bring David and Angela's empire to its knees. The van sped through the darkened streets, its headlights cutting a narrow path through the night. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Carson drove with steady precision, his hands gripping the wheel as he navigated the twisting roads away from the intercept point. Camilla sat in the passenger seat, her laptop balanced on her knees as she monitored the security feeds. Alice and Margot were in the back, surrounded by the crates they had recovered, each one marked with ominous labels that hinted at their dangerous contents. Alice couldn't take her eyes off the largest crate, her mind racing with questions about what lay inside. The earlier adrenaline rush of the operation had begun to fade, leaving behind a gnawing sense of unease. She glanced at Margot, who was inspecting the labels with a furrowed brow. "These look like medical supplies," Margot muttered, though her tone was skeptical. "But they're shipping them like contraband. That doesn't add up." "It's a front," Camilla called from the front seat, not looking up from her screen. "The documentation I pulled from the database confirmed it. The real cargo is in the sealed containers, viral samples and chemical agents." Alice's stomach churned. She thought of the lives that could be destroyed if these weapons were unleashed and felt the familiar fire of determination ignite within her. "We have to get this to the authorities," she said firmly. "If we can expose this, we can stop David and Angela for good." Carson's voice cut through the conversation. "First, we need to make it out of here in one piece. They're not going to let this slide." As if on cue, the faint roar of engines reached their ears. Alice tensed, turning to look out the rear window. Two dark SUVs were closing in fast, their headlights cutting through the night like searchlights. "We've got company," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Carson glanced in the rearview mirror, his jaw tightening. "Hold on," he said, accelerating. The van lurched forward, the crates rattling as they picked up speed. "Camilla, can you pull up their positions?" "I'm on it," Camilla replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Within moments, the tablet displayed a map showing the two SUVs in pursuit. "They're coordinating, one on the main road, the other trying to cut us off." "Of course they are," Margot muttered, reaching for the tranq gun they had stashed in the back. "They don't make this easy, do they?" Alice braced herself as Carson swerved sharply, taking a side street in an attempt to lose their pursuers. The van skidded slightly, the tires squealing against the pavement. The SUVs adjusted their course, staying close behind. "We need to slow them down," Carson said through gritted teeth. "Camilla, any ideas?" "There's a construction site a few blocks ahead," she said quickly. "If you can get there, we might be able to block them off." Carson nodded, adjusting their route. "Hold on," he warned again, the van accelerating as they raced toward the site. Alice gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding as the pursuit intensified. The SUVs were gaining on them, their engines roaring louder with each passing second. This was far from over. The van careened into the narrow street leading toward the construction site, its headlights bouncing off stacks of steel beams and half-finished structures. Carson expertly weaved through the tight spaces, the uneven terrain jarring everyone inside. Behind them, the SUVs roared closer, their drivers relentless in their pursuit. "They're not backing down," Alice said, her voice strained as she clung to the seat for balance. "They won't," Carson replied tersely. "Not until we give them a reason to." Margot crouched in the back, her hands deftly assembling a makeshift trap from one of the smaller crates. She pulled out a coil of chain and a few heavy tools, her movements quick and precise. "If we can get them to slow down, I can buy us some time," she said, glancing at Carson. "Do it," Carson barked without hesitation. "We'll need every second." Margot climbed toward the rear doors, carefully unlatching them. The rush of cool night air flooded the van as she opened the doors just enough to peer out. One of the SUVs was within spitting distance, its headlights glaring like twin predators locked on their prey. With a sharp exhale, Margot tossed the chain out, letting it unfurl behind them. The metal links clattered loudly on the ground before snapping taut. The chain caught under the SUV's front wheels, yanking the vehicle off course. The driver overcorrected, and the SUV veered sharply, slamming into a stack of steel beams with a deafening crash. "One down," Margot muttered, slamming the doors shut again. She turned back to the others, her expression grim. "But the second one's still on us." Camilla's voice cut through the chaos. "Almost there. The construction site has a bottleneck up ahead. If we hit it right, we can force them to slow down or risk crashing." Carson nodded, his focus razor-sharp as he navigated toward the site's entrance. The second SUV closed in, its tires screeching as it maneuvered the tight turns. Alice's pulse raced as the van hurtled toward the bottleneck, a narrow passage flanked by towering stacks of concrete barriers. "Everyone, hang on!" Carson yelled. The van barreled through the opening, its sides narrowly missing the barriers. Carson jerked the wheel, skidding the vehicle sideways just as the SUV followed. The pursuing car attempted to squeeze through the same gap, but the driver miscalculated. The SUV clipped one of the barriers, sending it spinning out of control before crashing into a support beam. Alice felt the van shudder as the sound of the collision echoed through the construction site. Carson didn't slow, guiding the van out of the site and back onto the open road. Camilla exhaled loudly, her relief palpable. "That should keep them off us for a while," she said, glancing at the tablet. "No other vehicles in the immediate area." Margot leaned back against the side of the van, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Nice driving," she said to Carson. "Remind me never to bet against you." Carson didn't respond, his focus still on the road ahead. Alice glanced at him, noting the tension in his jaw and the flicker of concern in his eyes. He had managed to get them out of the immediate danger, but they all knew this wasn't the end. As the van sped toward their rendezvous point, Alice leaned her head against the window, her thoughts swirling. They had secured the evidence and escaped the pursuit, but the weight of what they were fighting against loomed large. David and Angela wouldn't stop. They couldn't afford to. And neither, Alice realized, could she. "Where to now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Carson's eyes flicked to her in the rearview mirror. "To the safe site. We regroup, analyze what we've got, and plan the next move." Alice nodded, her resolve hardening. The fight was far from over, but tonight they had struck a blow, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The tension in the safe house was palpable as the group gathered around Camilla's laptop. The screen displayed a grid of data they had pulled from the recovered crates, encrypted documents, shipment manifests, and lab reports. Each piece of evidence painted a chilling picture of the operation David and Angela had built, a sprawling network of corruption and power, all centered around the development of a bioweapon with devastating potential. Alice sat at the table, her eyes fixed on one of the reports. It detailed test results from a compound she couldn't begin to comprehend, but the implications were clear. Lives were at stake, and the weapon's reach extended far beyond anything she had imagined. "They're planning a demonstration," Camilla said, breaking the heavy silence. She pointed to a section of a document on the screen. "Tomorrow night, at the Global Medical Conference in New York. Angela's listed as a keynote speaker, but this says she's using the event as cover to test the bioweapons dispersal system." Alice's stomach dropped. "She's going to release it there?" Carson leaned over the table, his jaw tight as he read the highlighted section. "Not a full-scale release," he said, his voice low, "but enough to make an impact, to prove it works and scare their potential buyers into action." Margot, standing by the door with her arms crossed, let out a sharp breath. "That conference is packed with doctors, researchers, and policymakers. If she pulls this off, it'll be chaos." Alice's hands clenched into fists. We have to stop her. We will, Carson said, his tone resolute. But it won't be easy. Security at the conference will be tight, and Angela will have her own people watching her back. Camilla nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up a map of the conference venue. This is where it's happening, she said, zooming in on the layout of the event space. The main hall is here, and this, she pointed to a smaller room connected to the hall, is likely where the dispersal device will be staged. It's isolated enough to set it up without drawing attention. Alice studied the map, her mind racing as she tried to piece together a plan. How do we get in? Camilla grinned. With these. She reached into her bag and pulled out a set of forged conference badges. You and Carson will go as delegates. Margot and I will stay off-site and provide support. Once you're inside, I'll guide you to the device using the venue's security feed. And then? Alice asked, though she already knew the answer. Carson's expression was grim. We disable it and get out, no matter what. The room fell silent as the weight of the mission settled over them. They were walking into the lion's den with no guarantee of success. But Alice knew there was no other choice. If they didn't act, countless lives could be lost. Let's get ready, Carson said, breaking the silence. We leave in an hour. As the group dispersed to prepare, Alice remained at the table, staring at the map on the screen. This was the moment she had been building toward, the chance to confront Angela and David, to take back her life and stop their plans once and for all. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. The bustling energy of the conference hit Alice the moment she stepped through the glass doors of the grand event center. The venue was alive with movement, attendees milling about in sleek business attire, animated conversations filling the air, and large digital displays showcasing cutting-edge medical advancements. It was a stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath her calm exterior. Alice clutched the lanyard around her neck, the forged badge bearing her name, and a fabricated title, Dr. Alice Leclerc, Research Fellow. Beside her, Carson moved with practiced ease, his sharp suit and confident demeanor allowing him to blend seamlessly into the crowd. Stay close, Carson murmured, his voice barely audible over the din. He carried a messenger bag that concealed the tools they would need to dismantle Angela's dispersal device. We'll make our way to the staging area, but we need to stay inconspicuous. Alice nodded, her heart pounding as they moved toward the main exhibition hall. She forced herself to focus, scanning the faces around her for any sign of David's or Angela's men. Everything about the scene felt surreal. The bright lights, the polished conversations, the veneer of innovation masking the sinister plan unfolding behind the scenes. Carson, can you hear me? Camilla's voice crackled softly through the earpiece hidden in Alice's hair. Loud and clear, Carson replied, keeping his tone casual as he adjusted his badge. Good. You're coming up on the main hall now, Camilla continued. Angela's set to speak in 15 minutes, but her team has already moved into position. I'm tapping into the venue's security feed to track their movements. Head toward the north corridor. It'll take you straight to the staging room. Understood, Carson said, his eyes scanning the area ahead. He nudged Alice gently, signaling for her to follow as he veered away from the bustling crowd. The corridor was quieter, the polished floors gleaming under the overhead lights. As they walked, Alice noticed a pair of men in dark suits standing near an unmarked door, their postures rigid and alert. Her pulse quickened. These weren't ordinary security guards. They were part of Angela's team. They're guarding the staging room, Alice whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Carson nodded, his expression calm. We'll need a distraction to draw them away. I've got you covered, Camilla interjected through the earpiece. "Give me 30 seconds." Alice's grip on her lanyard tightened as the seconds ticked by. Then a shrill alarm sounded, echoing through the corridor. The guards exchanged a glance before one of them reached for his radio. Moments later, they both moved swiftly toward the direction of the noise. "Go now," Camilla urged. Carson wasted no time, striding toward the door and motioning for Alice to follow. He produced a slim lock-picking tool from his bag, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The lock clicked open, and Carson pushed the door ajar, scanning the room for any immediate threats before stepping inside. Alice followed, her breath catching as she took in the sight before her. The staging room was stark and clinical, dominated by a large metal case sitting on a wheeled cart. The device inside was sleek and compact, its ominous purpose unmistakable. A laptop sat nearby, its screen displaying a countdown timer. "This is it," Carson said grimly. He turned to Alice, his eyes sharp. "We've got less than 15 minutes to disable it and get out." Alice nodded, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of determination. "Let's do this." Carson moved quickly to the laptop connected to the dispersal device, his hands steady as he examined the interface. The countdown on the screen ticked ominously, each passing second a stark reminder of the urgency of their mission. Alice stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the sleek machine that represented Angela's calculated malice. "Camilla, we're in," Carson said, his voice calm but firm. "The device is active, and the countdown's at 14 minutes. "Got it," Camilla replied through the earpiece. "I'll walk you through disabling it. But be warned, it's not just a standard setup. They've added layers of encryption and physical security. Angela's not taking any chances." "Figures," Carson muttered. He opened the laptop, navigating through the interface as Camilla guided him. The screen was filled with lines of code and warning prompts, each one more intimidating than the last. Alice's gaze darted between Carson and the device. Her mind raced, recalling the documents they had reviewed about Angela's projects. "The dispersal mechanism? It's set to release the agent through the building's ventilation system, right?" "Exactly," Carson said, not looking up. "If we don't disable it here, the whole conference is at risk." Alice clenched her fists. "Then let's make sure that doesn't happen." Carson nodded, his focus unwavering. "Camilla, what's the first step?" "There's a failsafe built into the software," Camilla explained. "You'll need to bypass it before you can access the core controls. Look for a file labeled Protocol Alpha and disable it. But be careful, it might trigger an alert." "Understood," Carson said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. After a tense moment, he found the file and executed the command to disable it. A progress bar appeared on the screen, moving excruciatingly slowly. Alice kept her eyes on the door, her nerves on edge. The alarm Camilla had triggered earlier wouldn't keep the guards distracted forever. They were running out of time. "Carson, how much longer?" she asked, her voice tight. "It's processing," he replied. "Just a few more seconds." As if on cue, the progress bar completed and a new window opened, displaying the device's operational settings. Camilla's voice came through the earpiece again, her tone urgent. "Good. Now override the activation sequence. There should be a panel on the device itself. Alice, can you see it?" Alice turned to the machine, her hands trembling slightly as she located the small panel Camilla had described. "I see it," she said. "What do I do?" "There's a sequence of wires inside," Camilla explained. "Red, blue, green. You'll need to cut the red and green wires in that order. Don't touch the blue one. It's connected to a backup trigger." Alice nodded, taking a deep breath to steady her hands. She reached into Carson's bag for a pair of wire cutters and carefully opened the panel. The wires were arranged tightly, their colors vivid against the metallic interior. Her heart pounded as she positioned the cutters over the red wire. "Here goes nothing," she murmured, snipping the wire with a quick, decisive motion. Nothing happened. Good, Camilla said, her voice calm but insistent. Now the green one. Alice adjusted her grip and cut the green wire, her breath catching as the device emitted a faint beep. For a moment she froze, expecting an alarm to blare, but the room remained silent. It worked, Camilla confirmed. The dispersal mechanism is disabled. Relief washed over Alice, but it was short-lived. Carson's voice cut through the moment. We've got a problem, he said, his tone sharp. The countdown hasn't stopped. It's still running. Alice's stomach sank as she turned to the laptop, the ominous timer still ticking down. Whatever they had done, it wasn't enough to stop the device entirely. Alice's heart raced as she stared at the relentless countdown on the laptop screen. The numbers ticked lower, each second slipping away like sand through her fingers. "Camilla," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "The timer's still going. What are we missing?" Camilla's response was immediate, but laced with tension. "It means there's a secondary trigger. Angela must have built in a failsafe in case someone tried to disable the primary mechanism." Carson clenched his jaw, his hands still working on the keyboard. "How do we shut it down?" "I'm checking the schematics now," Camilla said, the sound of frantic typing filling the earpiece. "There should be a manual override, but it's probably hidden on the device itself. Alice, check the casing. Look for any panels or markings that don't match the rest." Alice dropped to her knees beside the machine, her eyes scanning its sleek metallic surface. Her fingers traced over its edges, feeling for anything out of place. Her heart skipped a beat when she found a small recessed panel near the base, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "I think I found it," she said, prying the panel open with trembling hands. Inside was a small circuit board with a single glowing red button. "Camilla, there's a button here," Alice said, her voice unsteady. "What do I do with it?" "Don't press it," Camilla snapped. "It's probably a failsafe detonator. That's Angela's style. Give someone just enough rope to hang themselves." Alice pulled her hand back, her breath catching at the thought of how close she had come to disaster. "Then what's the real override?" "There should be a code input nearby," Camilla said. "A sequence of numbers tied to the device's encryption." Alice's eyes darted around the interior of the panel until she spotted a small keypad embedded in the corner. "I see it," she said. "What's the code?" "That's the problem," Camilla replied grimly. "The code isn't in the database. It's stored on a secure server. There's no time to hack it." Carson stepped forward, his face set with determination. "Then we guess." Alice stared at him, incredulous. "Guess? Carson, if we get it wrong—" "We don't have a choice," he interrupted, his voice firm. "The timer's down to 7 minutes. Either we try or we let this thing go off." Alice swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced at the keypad, her mind racing. Angela was methodical, calculating. What kind of code would she use? A date? A sequence of numbers tied to her research? "Start with the obvious," Carson said. 4 digits. Try the date of the gala." Alice's fingers moved instinctively, entering the numbers. The keypad beeped, but the countdown continued unabated. "Wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "We're running out of time." Carson stepped in beside her, his gaze locked on the keypad. "Try the launch year of her first company. It was in the files, 2016. Alice entered the code, her heart pounding. Another beep, another failure. 5 minutes, Camilla's voice warned, the tension in her tone mirroring Alice's own. Alice's mind raced. Then a thought struck her, something from her mother's journal. Claire had written about Angela's obsession with symbolism, her need to tie her work to significant milestones. "Try 0612, Alice said suddenly, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Carson frowned. What's that? June 12th, the date Angela first presented her bioweapon concept to investors. My mother noted it in her journal. Carson nodded. Do it. Alice's fingers hovered over the keys before pressing them with deliberate precision. 0612. The keypad let out a low chime, and the countdown froze at 3 minutes and 14 seconds. It worked, Camilla exclaimed. The device is offline. Relief crashed over Alice like a wave, her shoulders sagging as the tension ebbed. But the victory was short-lived. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder with each passing moment. They're coming, Carson said, his voice sharp. He grabbed the laptop and the small memory drives containing the stolen data. We've got what we need. Let's move. Alice rose to her feet, her adrenaline surging anew as Carson yanked the staging room door open. Outside, the faint sound of Angela's voice echoed through the conference hall, announcing her keynote address. We're not out of this yet, Carson muttered as they slipped into the shadows, the spectre of danger still looming over them. Alice's breath came in shallow gasps as she and Carson slipped into the alley behind the conference center. The echoes of Angela's speech still rang in her ears, a chilling reminder of how close they had come to disaster. The deactivated dispersal device weighed heavily in her mind, a silent testament to their victory. But the battle wasn't over yet. Keep moving, Carson urged, his voice low but firm. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkened street for any sign of pursuit. Their escape had been clean so far, but Alice knew better than to trust in luck. David's men wouldn't stay disoriented for long. Camilla's voice crackled in their earpieces. You're clear for now, but don't stop. Angela's people are scrambling, and it's only a matter of time before they realize the device is gone. Alice tightened her grip on the bag slung over her shoulder, its contents the key to dismantling Angela and David's operation. What about Angela? She asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She's still inside, Camilla replied, probably buying time, trying to figure out how to salvage her plan. If she realizes the device is offline, she'll double down, Carson finished grimly. We need to get this evidence to the authorities before she has a chance to retaliate. They rounded a corner, the alley opening into a quiet street lined with parked cars. Margot was waiting for them near an unassuming sedan, her sharp eyes scanning the area as they approached. She opened the door, motioning for them to hurry. Get in, she said tersely. We've got a window, but it's closing fast. Alice slid into the back seat, Carson following close behind. Margot started the car, her movements quick but precise. The engine purred to life, and they pulled away from the curb, leaving the chaos of the conference center behind. As they sped through the city, the weight of their actions began to sink in. Alice stared out the window, her mind replaying the events of the night, the infiltration, the countdown, the moment the device had been deactivated. They had succeeded in stopping Angela's immediate plan, but the larger fight still loomed. We did it, Margot said after a long silence, her tone a mix of relief and exhaustion. At least the hard part. Carson shook his head. Not yet. We've got the evidence, but we still need to make sure it reaches the right hands. David and Angela have connections. They'll try to bury this if we're not careful. Alice turned to him, her resolve clear in her eyes. Then we make sure they can't. Carson met her gaze, a flicker of admiration crossing his features. You've come a long way, he said quietly. From the girl who kissed a guard to escape a wedding. Alice allowed herself a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't have a choice, and I don't now either. Carson nodded, his expression softening. Number, but you're making the right one. The car fell silent again as they approached their destination, a secure location where Camilla had arranged to meet with a trusted contact in law enforcement. Alice's chest tightened as the gravity of the situation hit her. This was their last chance to expose the truth, to end the nightmare that David and Angela had created. There was no room for error. The car pulled into an underground parking garage, its dim lighting casting long shadows over the concrete walls. Margot killed the engine, and the group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. Carson was the first to move, opening the door and stepping out with the bag of evidence in hand. "Camilla said level 2, northeast corner," he murmured as the others followed him. Alice felt the cold air of the garage seep into her skin as they moved quickly but cautiously. Her eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for signs of danger. Margot stayed close, her hand resting lightly on the tranq gun tucked into her jacket. The silence of the garage was oppressive, each footstep echoing loudly in Alice's ears. When they reached the designated meeting spot, a man in a dark suit was already waiting for them. His posture was confident but not threatening, and his sharp gaze swept over the group before settling on Carson. "You must be Daniel," Carson said, his voice measured. The man nodded, extending his hand. "Detective Daniel Hayes. Camilla briefed me on the situation. Do you have it?" Carson handed over the bag, his movements careful. "Everything's in there. Files, schematics, video evidence from the staging room. It's enough to take down David and Angela, but only if it sees the light of day." Daniel unzipped the bag, his expression growing grim as he inspected the contents. "This is a lot," he admitted. "If even half of it is accurate, it'll blow their operation wide open." "It's all accurate," Alice said, her voice steady but firm. She stepped forward, meeting Daniel's gaze with unwavering determination. "This isn't just about stopping them, it's about justice. For everyone they've hurt, everyone they would have hurt." Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You have my word. I'll make sure this gets to the right people." A flicker of relief passed through the group, but the moment was short-lived. The sound of screeching tires echoed through the garage, followed by the harsh beam of headlights cutting through the shadows. Alice's stomach clenched as a black SUV barreled into view, its doors already opening before it skidded to a stop. "They found us!" Carson growled, pulling Alice behind him as he reached for the tranq gun tucked into his holster. "Move now!" Margot was already reacting, drawing her weapon and taking cover behind a pillar. Daniel grabbed the bag and ducked down, his phone in hand as he called for backup. The air was thick with tension as armed men poured out of the SUV, their movements swift and coordinated. Alice's pulse pounded in her ears as the first shots rang out, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the garage. Carson returned fire, his aim precise as he took down one of the attackers. Margot flanked another, her movements quick and decisive. "Stay down!" Carson barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. He grabbed Alice's arm, pulling her further into the cover of the concrete structure. "We can't let them take the evidence." Alice's mind raced, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. But she pushed it aside, focusing on the weight of what was at stake. "We won't," she said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. From her vantage point, she spotted a man attempting to flank them, his focus on Carson. Without thinking, Alice grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it with all her strength, knocking him out cold. Her hands trembled as she dropped the improvised weapon, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. "Nice work," Carson said with a faint grin as he reloaded. "Remind me never to underestimate you." The fight dragged on, the air thick with smoke and tension. Finally, the sound of sirens echoed through the garage, a welcome sign of approaching backup. The attackers hesitated, their formation faltering, One by one, they began retreating, slipping back into the SUV and speeding away into the night. As the garage fell silent, Alice slumped against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. Carson crouched beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "No," Alice replied, her voice firm despite her weariness. "Not yet." Daniel approached, the bag of evidence still clutched tightly in his hand. "I'll make sure this gets where it needs to go," he said, his tone resolute. "You've done your part. Now, let us finish this." Alice nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She had fought harder than she ever thought possible, but now it was out of her hands. As Daniel walked away, flanked by officers who had arrived to secure the scene, Alice felt a bittersweet sense of closure. Carson helped her to her feet, his steady presence grounding her. "You did it," he said, his voice laced with pride. "You fought back." Alice looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "We did it," she corrected. Together, they stepped out of the shadows of the garage into the faint glow of the city lights. The fight was over, but Alice knew her journey was just beginning. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of hope and the promise of a future she had reclaimed for herself.